Great. Okay. So, hi everyone. So thank you so much for coming today. This discussion group is the first in our series on South Asian philosophy. If you're interested in the other discussion groups as well, you can find us on Facebook by the name Oxford Public Philosophy, and our website is also in the same name. So today we have with us Professor Parimal G. Patil, who is Professor of Religion and Indian Philosophy at Harvard University. His primary academic interests are in the history of philosophy in India and its relevance to disciplinary work in philosophy, South Asian studies, and the study of religion. He has focused on Buddhist philosophy in India, the Old and New Epistemologists, and Indian traditions of physicalism and skepticism, with long-standing interest in contemporary Anglo-American philosophy of religion. Today, he will give us an introduction to South Asian philosophy with a focus on Sanskrit philosophy and so-called Indian philosophy. We'll begin with Parimal's talk, introducing the topic, and then open up to the audience for questions and comments. So please use the chat to put your questions through or just jump in by unmuting. I'm also going to upload a handout that Parimal sent me so that it's available to download. And yeah, we'll just get started with Parimal.
Great. Thank you, Shruti, for organizing this, and everyone else who had a hand in inviting me. I'm happy to spend part of this afternoon, my afternoon, with all of you, and I'm really grateful that you've chosen to spend part of your evening participating in a conversation about South Asian philosophy. I should just say at the outset, my primary goal is to be useful to all of you, and to do that, feel free to tell me what's interesting to you and what you'd like to pursue. So what I was asked to do was give an overview of South Asian philosophy, which I can only do in sort of an opinionated way. And as you see the handout, I'm not going to read the handout. There's really only 6 main ideas I thought I would try to get out in the 30 or 45 minutes I have, and we can go back and talk about other things. So the point of the handout is just to give you something to look at. And if I've done it right, there'll be things on the handout that you'll agree with. Hopefully there's things on the handout that you'll really disagree with and that will then elicit some comment or criticism, which I'm always open to. And hopefully there'll be something on the handout or in our conversation that you'll learn that will be new to you. That's sort of what I hope to do. So I want it to be informal and open. And I thought I would just start talking, and I'll try to finish in 30 minutes or so, or I'll just automatically finish in 30 or 45 minutes and then we'll be done. And then we can talk about it. So the first topic is sort of, how do we think about what is South Asian philosophy? And in particular, why, given that I was asked to talk about South Asian philosophy, am I going to talk primarily about Sanskrit philosophy? It's always, when we have a label like South Asian philosophy, it's always important to ask the question of exactly where is South Asia and to what does it refer? And what about its adjectival forms, South Asian, and sometimes related forms like Indian or Sanskrit or Sanskritic? As you all know, South Asia is obviously a historically sensitive term, as are its adjectival forms. It picked out different regions and different areas at different times in the past. And so in an important sense, there really is no there. There is no there that South Asia that explains what South Asian philosophy is. Or you could think of it alternatively, there's just too many different theirs. So the reason I don't use the term South Asian philosophy is I don't think there is a there. And when we begin to look at how vast it is, I'm not sure that it carves out a meaningful subfield for philosophy. That's perfectly fine. Subfields in philosophy themselves have subfields. And one could use the term South Asian philosophy and say that Sanskrit philosophy is one of its subfields. That's an issue of terminology primarily. What about Indian philosophy, which is the term that's often used to discuss South Asian philosophy? And obviously, when it's used that way, in the term Indian philosophy, Indian does not, and of course, should not refer to the modern nation state, right? Again, it's a historically sensitive term. Again, there's no there, or there's too many theirs there, depending on how you understand the way history works. What about the term Sanskrit philosophy then? To what does it refer? It's kind of just like ancient Greek philosophy in a sense, right? But by Sanskrit philosophy, what I mean in particular is it refers to Buddhist philosophy. It might include some Tibetan Buddhist philosophy. It includes so-called Brahminical philosophy. It includes Jaina philosophy. And it might also include Sanskrit texts that are not themselves works of philosophy, but could be the basis for philosophical work. Right? So for example, people do philosophical work with The Matrix, a movie. The Matrix isn't itself a work of philosophy per se. So there are Sanskrit texts that aren't necessarily philosophical that one could do philosophical work with that I think would be a proper part of Sanskrit philosophy. It's important to ask what the term Sanskrit philosophy leaves out that also ought to be included in something like South Asian philosophy. And it leaves out an awful lot, right? It obviously leaves out Islamic philosophy in both Persian and Arabic. There are, as you know, hundreds, if not thousands of manuscripts in Persian and Arabic produced in what we now call India that are all but rotting in manuscript libraries. It also leaves out Indian philosophy in English. There was plenty of that. It also leaves out philosophy in South Asian vernaculars. It leaves out oral traditions. So you might think, why not use the term South Asian philosophy? And as I said, one could, as long as one recognizes that I'm just talking about one subfield of it, which is Sanskrit philosophy. If we're trying to figure out what South Asian philosophy is, we've done a little bit of interrogation of what South Asian is, we should also ask what philosophy is. And in my view, when we think about fields like South Asian philosophy or Indic philosophy or Sanskrit philosophy, it's best to think of philosophy as an academic discipline and not as an intellectual practice. And in my view, even worse, as a way of life. So if Sanskrit philosophy, or whatever its preferred name turns out to be, is to be recognized as a subfield in philosophy as a discipline, it has to work within the existing conventions, even as it seeks to change them. So in my view, this seemingly conservative approach is the approach to take because it actually works. I should also say, for what it's worth, that I can't think of many, if any, of the individuals we consider to be Sanskrit philosophers from pre-modern India who would oppose this idea or not fully be able to participate in the contemporary discipline. I also don't take this view of philosophy to be terribly restrictive. I recognize that there's really good philosophy that's not academic, and also that what currently counts as academic philosophy is going to change. You might worry that this idea of treating philosophy, when we think of Sanskrit philosophy as being an intellectual discipline, that is an intellectual discipline that's been formed in the modern West, is doing intellectual violence to Sanskrit philosophy, right? And that it's another example of a kind of intellectual colonialism. It's something we can talk about. I obviously think that's not the case. So it's something we can talk about, hopefully, in the questions. If we now have an idea of what Sanskrit philosophy, what South Asian philosophy is, in the sense of what the subfield of Sanskrit philosophy is I'm going to talk about, and what philosophy is as I'm going to use the term as an academic discipline, we should think something about the philosophical neighborhoods, the groups of philosophers maybe, who make up the Sanskrit philosophical landscape, if you will. Forgive the mixed metaphors. I'm not going to read or go in great detail, but I just want to give you an idea. I think most of you already know, but an idea of what constitutes Sanskrit philosophy and what constitutes Sanskrit philosophers, at least the most relevant ones to the work I do, and the most relevant ones, I think, to what professional philosophers might be interested in engaging with. And we'll talk about that label, professional philosophers, a little bit later if you'd like. The idea here is, if we need to get an overview of really well over 1,500 years of philosophical work in a vast area, in an intellectual tradition which had hundreds and thousands of intellectuals working and funded, it gets very difficult. So how do we approach it from a bird's eye view? That's sort of what I want to do for the next 5 minutes or so. There's obviously traditions of Buddhist philosophy that was done in Sanskrit in India. And there were many diverse Buddhist traditions. So these Buddhist traditions, not all, let's say the distinct Buddhist traditions did not agree with each other at all, right? They're fundamental differences. Their worldviews were often incompatible when it came to issues of metaphysics and issues of ontology. And what I've done on the handout is just list some of the major Buddhist philosophical traditions. We should ask, what do I mean by tradition? What makes a tradition a Buddhist philosophical tradition? And what makes one of the subfields of Buddhist philosophy, a Buddhist philosophical tradition. So for example, people have probably heard, I shouldn't say that. There are traditions of Buddhist philosophy that are called so-called mind-only traditions. There are those that are called middle way traditions. There are those that are called abhidharma or descriptive ontology traditions. There's a range of different traditions. What makes something a tradition, as I understand it, is it's best to think of each of these traditions as being defined by a foundational text. And in relation, sometimes called a sutra text, right? In relation to which philosophers develop and construct their own philosophical systems. So that means middle way Buddhist philosophers would have a foundational text. You might think of that foundational text as Nagarjuna's fundamental wisdom of the middle way, right? You might think of, anyway, you get the idea, foundational text in relation to which philosophers construct their philosophical systems. It's worth pointing out something about what in relation to might mean. And what I mean by it is in relation to means either that they comment on that foundational text, or they work with its central principles as they construct their philosophical systems. I want to take a second, well, first, so if you think of just Sanskrit Buddhist philosophy and think of these different philosophical traditions that have different philosophical texts, there is a sense in which there is no such thing as Buddhist philosophy either. If you think you can say, here are the X principles that make someone a Buddhist philosopher, or here are the views that all Buddhist philosophers share. So it's best to think not of Buddhist philosophy, not even of Sanskrit Buddhist philosophy, but as particular traditions of Sanskrit Buddhist philosophy. It might be worth it right now to talk a little bit about what commentaries are, because people often think of Indian philosophical texts or Sanskrit philosophical texts as being of a commentarial nature. Not all of them are, but I think we have the wrong idea of commentary. So I want to just leave you with an image. The way I think of commentaries and the relation between foundational text and the philosophical work that intellectuals are doing on the basis of them is in terms of, in the US, we have a store called Home Depot, and in the UK, it's called B&Q, right? Everyone knows it's a big box store. So think of a foundational text like B&Q, right? How do you decide who's made best use of B&Q? How do you decide who's made best use of B&Q? And how do you understand the people who are building things based on the parts in B&Q? My point is that most Sanskrit commentators, most foundational texts are like B&Q. They're a place for parts. And that people who are commenting, even when they claim to be doing faithful exegesis, what they're doing is they're building something new out of the parts that they find in the foundational text. Some people, they have different rules on how you build properly, right, normatively. Some people think, okay, B&Q has a plumbing section, you have to only use that for plumbing in your new house, your new philosophical house. Other people say, no, the rules are such that just because BQ has it in plumbing doesn't mean that I can't use it in the living room. And two philosophers then may fight about who has made best use of the foundational text. So commenting is a creative, constructive act. And it's a mistake to think that the way in which we understand things like exegesis is the way in which they understood what exegesis was. So we can talk more about Home Depot and what that's like. We talked about these Buddhist philosophical traditions, which are rather familiar to most people, or to people who have some experience with Indian philosophy or Sanskrit philosophy, middle way, mind only, etc. There are other kinds of terms that people use when they talk about philosophy in pre-modern India that are not text traditions in this sense, but that have a different relationship to the text traditions. I'll give you just one example. For those who know about Buddhist philosophy, people often speak about Buddhist epistemologists, right? People like Dharmakirti and Dignaga. And one thing to remember is that Buddhist epistemology is not like middle way Buddhism. It's not like mind-only Buddhism. Buddhist epistemology is a kind of method that people belonging to any of those traditions of Buddhist philosophy can choose to adopt. So you have mind-only Buddhist philosophers who are Buddhist epistemologists. You have middle way Buddhist philosophers who are also Buddhist epistemologists. Why is this worth mentioning? It's worth mentioning because the labels we use, the doxographic labels we use to talk about philosophy in India and pre-modern India, often confuse us more than they need to. So it's important to think about which traditions have foundational texts and commentarial traditions, and which so-called traditions are really more methods or approaches that people belonging to different text traditions can actually take and use. All right, so if that's the Buddhist philosophical, if that's the Buddhist philosophical neighborhoods, if you will, there's also non-Buddhist, and in one case, Brahminical traditions of philosophy. The ones that are most relevant, and you can argue with me about this, are the grammatical tradition, the Mimamsa ritualist tradition, and the Nyaya and Vaisheshika epistemological tradition. People often hear the term of Vedanta, which is really, I think, best thought of as a tradition of philosophical theology or philosophical dharmaology. And there's, of course, a dizzying variety of different Vedantas, and a great deal of philosophical work was done by Vedantins. But I think it's best to think of them as traditions of philosophical theology. Think of a Jesuit chemist, for example. Excellent chemistry may have been done by Jesuits, right? Just like excellent philosophy is done by Vedantins, if that makes sense. It was kind of like their day job. That's a little bit loose, but it's one helpful way to think about it, I think. You'll notice that I didn't talk, one of the things that most people who even have heard a little bit about philosophy in India come away with is the so-called 6 systems of Indian philosophy. I don't know if you've heard about it. Often it's this pairing of Sankhya and Yoga, Nyaya and Vaisheshika, Mimamsa and Vedanta. So the 6 systems is a historical myth, and in my view, a completely bankrupt way to think about the history of philosophy in India. We'll talk about more on this below. You'll also notice that yoga isn't in my list, nor is Sankhya. And we can talk about why that's the case. I should say there's really just like there's no Buddhist philosophy in the way I described it, there's also no Brahminical philosophy either. We have different text traditions of Brahminical philosophy, just like there's different text traditions of Buddhist philosophy. And the ones I mentioned are in some ways the most salient and most relevant for the body of texts and work that we have. And we can talk about why the others aren't, why the others you might expect to be there aren't in the list. That's a way in conversation. There's other neighborhoods, not just the Buddhist and Brahminical one, right? There's neighborhoods of the so-called materialists or physicalists. There's philosophical neighborhoods of Jaina philosophers, which is incredibly important. The Jaina philosophical tradition is extremely rich. They knew everything about everybody, and they argued with everybody. What's interesting is that not as many people argued back. We can talk about why that's the case, but they're an incredibly rich source of philosophical insight. As I mentioned, there's also Islamic, Persian, and Arabic traditions. There's something really interesting about the Persian and Arabic philosophical traditions is there's almost no philosophical interaction between Persian and Arabic writing philosophers and Sanskrit philosophers. This is surprising because in almost every other aspect of life, intellectual and otherwise, there was clearly extensive interaction between Persian and Arabic cultures, literatures, etc., and Sanskrit intellectual culture. There is interaction in more theological contexts, and that's very predictable. And you can explain why that interaction took place and the way in which it took place. But it's astonishing that, say, people writing in Arabic and Persian logical traditions, for example, were not interacting with their Sanskrit neighbors quite literally. I think one way to think about this is they really just they had different audiences. I don't know how it works at your home institutions, but at Harvard, for example, we have people who study Kant in the philosophy department, in the English department, sometimes in the anthropology department. They don't really talk to each other about Kant. They don't talk to each other about the issues that come up in Kant. They have different audiences, and that's where they direct their energy, even though when they meet each other in faculty meetings, they have a lot to talk about. I think the situation with philosophers working in Arabic and Persian in pre-modern India and with philosophers working in Sanskrit was a little bit like that. But that's also part of the neighborhood of what we would think about of South Asian philosophy. There's also Euro-American philosophy, of course, that was done, Indian philosophy in English. There's philosophy in the vernacular, as I mentioned, and there's contemporary Sanskrit philosophy. So we shouldn't think that the philosophical debates that began in pre-modern India have ended. There's contemporary Sanskrit philosophy, which takes place in many forms. There are philosophers who study traditional topics in traditional ways in Sanskrit medium. There are people who study traditional topics in modern ways, either in vernaculars or in Sanskrit or even in English. And there are people who study modern topics in traditional ways. So there is a group of, it is meaningful to talk about contemporary Sanskrit philosophy. And one thing that's really important when we think about this is that the internet actually, and what it shows is that there's an incredible flexibility to the tradition as well, even though it's not always thought of that way. And the internet provides us a way now, and provides all of you a way, with the real possibility of interacting with traditionally trained scholars, the real experts in these various traditions, without having to go to South Asia or India and spend months there. In most cases, it requires learning classical Sanskrit and being able to speak and understand it, but that's part of the fun too. But there's this whole world of contemporary Sanskrit philosophy. And if you just do a search on YouTube, you'll probably find Pandit Sabhas, debates that you could listen to that are all in Sanskrit. You'll get an idea of what it's like. So that was just topic one, and the others will be much faster. I'm trying to give some kind of opinionated overview of Sanskrit philosophy, and hopefully I've provoked some of you to ask some questions. The second idea is false and dangerous narratives. And the way to think of, I think this is pretty intuitive. I think we all can appreciate the challenges or the problems that come from having false narratives about oneself as individuals. And I think it's worth thinking about whether there's a problem with having false cultural or historical narratives as well. And to think about if there are such problems, what are they and how do they manifest themselves? I think that this is important to the topic at hand because I think that the standard picture or standard pictures that people have of South Asian philosophy or Sanskrit philosophy is a false and dangerous narrative. And what I put on the handout is one version of this false narrative. And those who have some exposure to South Asia or pre-modern India probably have heard it before. The idea is that there's kind of a Vedic period, an epic period, a classic period where you get heterodox, they use the word heterodox to mention Buddhists and Jains and materialists. Then you have orthodox, which means the Brahminical philosophical systems, as an important phase in the history of philosophy in India. You'll notice that Islamic philosophy is never mentioned, right? It's also said that during this period, the brilliant philosopher and theologian Shankara, or Dharmalogian Shankara, was supposed to have argued so powerfully that he chased the Buddhists out of India, which is, of course, demonstrably false and absurd. You also get a picture about the early modern period where somehow all of a sudden there are these devotional protest movements who are contesting Brahminical hegemony. And this is the rise of Vedanta. Again, the early modern period, Arabic, Persian writing intellectuals are never mentioned. Europeans are never usually mentioned as part of this false narrative. And the idea of devotional protest movements is raised as somehow contesting hegemony. Also really simplistic and not accurate to what was going on in terms of the philosophical landscape. You then also get another phase of the modern period where you get, again, Indian philosophy is turned over to the so-called nationalist Hindu reformer type people. Mm-hmm. There's no sense of how much the classical tradition continued in this period. So a critical part of this dangerous and false narrative, again, is the 6 systems. And what I put on the handout is just a little bit of a way of beginning to think about the 6 systems. 6 systems is a relatively new way of organizing the history of philosophy in India. As you can see, the 6 systems it's just Sankhya, Yoga, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Mimamsa, Vedanta, right? It excludes, it's as if Buddhism was irrelevant. Buddhism is phrased as the heterodox system. It's impossible to imagine any of these Brahminical philosophical traditions developing as they did without Buddhism and vice versa. It's just impossible. Any attempt to cleave those apart for its history is going to result in colossal errors, in my view. So if you're thinking about the history of philosophy in India, one can specialize, say, in Buddhist philosophical texts or in Nyaya texts, but it's really critical to remember that for at least until the 11th or 12th century, all of these traditions developed and were driven by each other. After the 11th or 12th century, in a way, Buddhist philosophical texts ceased to be primary sources for philosophical work for a variety of reasons. And basically, there were no new Buddhist texts produced in Sanskrit. And so the debate shifted to debates between everyone else who was still writing and producing texts in Sanskrit. What else I've done to hand is just giving you some traditional doxographies. to help destabilize the idea of the standard picture, and to suggest that the standard picture is not something that's neutral. It's not something that's a good intellectual starting point. Just like the six systems, it's something we shouldn't even begin to think with, because it sets us off in exactly the wrong way. So I think one of the things that we can do is to do ground clearing and free ourselves of the standard picture and free ourselves of the six systems. So what I've tried to do so far is we've talked a little bit about South Asian philosophy. I've tried to talk a little bit about Sanskrit philosophy, give you a little bit about the landscape of what's included in Sanskrit philosophy, maybe some ideas about how it might be helpful to think about it in terms of text traditions, a little bit about B and Q. I've tried to suggest something about the dangers of the false and familiar narratives, that they're not just okay starting points, that we should actually never start there. And I thought I'd talk a little bit about maybe something about the content of Sanskrit philosophy, which, as you know by now, I mean sort of Buddhist, Brahminical, and Jain debates, probably from the 5th to the 12th century, at least beginning with Vasubandhu and Dignaga. We should know that Sanskrit philosophy continues into the present, but as I mentioned earlier, for the most part, without Buddhist philosophical ideas. It's important to think about why sort of Sanskrit philosophy and philosophical debates between a wide range of philosophers really began with Dignaga or around Dignaga's time. And I think a simple way to put it is that we all know what it's like to be in a conversation where people talk past each other, right? You can overhear a conversation between two friends and you realize right away, wow, they're just going like this. They're just talking past each other. And we should ask, what does it take for there to be a genuine basis for agreement or disagreement? What does it take to make sure that you're actually talking to someone and debating an issue together and not talking past each other? At the very least, it might require a shared or shareable conceptual vocabulary. And what Dignaga succeeded in doing was creating a shareable conceptual vocabulary, that you could interpret the conceptual terms in different ways, but at least you shared the terms and shared some understanding of the semantic range. And that is one of the reasons why, a methodological reason why, around the time of Dignaga, debates really took off. What are these debates about? And how do they relate, say, to the contemporary discipline, which I think it's helpful to think about Sanskrit philosophy in terms of? It is, if I took 100 Sanskrit philosophical books and put them on a desk and asked you to sort them by subfield, you wouldn't have too much difficulty. You would find works that correspond to contemporary issues in aesthetics, in ontology, in metaphysics, in epistemology, philosophy of mind, philosophy of language, philosophy of religion. It would be absolutely no problem. There would be absolutely no problem. And what would be, maybe it would be disappointing to you to find out that a lot of those debates will seem eerily similar. They're very, very different, but they're also similar enough that you'll recognize what they are right away. The pile that will be empty will be moral and political philosophy as we currently recognize it. So my claim is, let's say, that there are no works in classical Sanskrit that we would easily identify as being works of moral and political philosophy as it's currently practiced, in the same way as there are works in all the other subfields of philosophy. Right? This does not mean that there wasn't a great deal of thinking about morals or about politics. What it means is that in pre-modern India, they didn't choose to think about what we would call ethics or what we would call political philosophy in the same way they chose to think about epistemology, metaphysics, etc. I think that's a deep and important point, because it suggests that they understood what the job of ethics was, or the job of political philosophy was, as being something very different than the job of epistemology, metaphysics, etc. And that job was best pursued in a different form, not in the same way they pursued epistemology, metaphysics, etc. Is that idea okay? So on the one hand, I'm saying there's no book of Sanskrit philosophical ethics. There's no book of Sanskrit philosophical political theory. That's not saying there aren't a lot of Sanskrit texts on the basis of which one could do excellent work in ethics and political theory. I'm just trying to point out that those areas, subfields, were pursued in a very different way. And the reason it's such a contrast is because all the other subfields were pursued in ways that will be very familiar to those of us who've been raised in contemporary philosophy departments. It's an interesting observation about which you can disagree with me with. I always ask people this: if you can think of a single example of a classical Sanskrit text that's a counterexample to my view. It's a good place to start. Okay. So all these subfields are present. And I said they began really at the time of Dignaga, if we think of debates between rival groups of Sanskrit philosophers in a large scale, and they continue into the present. I think there's very little evidence to think that there's any kind of deep epistemic break between the pre-modern and modern when it comes to Sanskrit philosophy per se. Something else we can argue about. I made this point before that there are plenty of Sanskrit texts that don't fit in my category of being philosophical texts, right? Because they wouldn't be considered philosophical texts by people in our Euro-American style philosophy departments. But that doesn't mean, as I said before as well, they can't be the basis for good philosophical work, and that people who are doing Sanskrit philosophy in contemporary philosophy departments can't focus on such texts. So one standard place, if you're interested in ethics and political philosophy, there's plenty of work in classical Sanskrit that you could do to do excellent philosophical work, just like people do philosophy with the matrix or music or literature. Right? Another thing is that one can use the resources developed in Sanskrit philosophical texts for purposes that the philosophers themselves didn't envision or imagine. So just because Sanskrit philosophers did not discuss, say, philosophy of race, doesn't mean they don't have something to say about it. If they were here today, there are resources that they could draw upon that would be useful and that we could then help ourselves to as we think about this further. So when I talk about what Sanskrit philosophy is, I really don't mean it to be restrictive. So I think that some areas are very, very familiar and seamlessly move into what happens in the discipline today. Others are more challenging. That's particularly ethics and political philosophy because it's different kinds of texts. And so if we're going to do contemporary philosophical work with those texts and not distort what those texts say and their decisions, it's a little bit harder. And we can also choose to use any Sanskrit philosophical text to do good philosophical work. That's perfectly fine. And we can choose to use the philosophical work done in Sanskrit philosophical texts for our own purposes. I think all that's fine. And that gets us to sort of the fourth idea I wanted to bring up, which was how does one approach, what are the different kinds of approaches to Sanskrit philosophy that you see out there? And what are the range of possibilities, or at least part of a range of possibilities? The one approach is to take a very philological approach. And this is where people work by producing editions and textually grounded studies and modern language, I'll say reconstructions rather than translations of the original. This is of critical importance in fields like Sanskrit philosophy because so few of even the most important texts have been properly edited or translated or even studied in a simple way. Imagine how we would do contemporary European philosophy without translations of Kant or even editions of Kant. The situation with classical Sanskrit philosophy is like that. The most important figures, the most important texts have not been properly edited yet, have not been properly translated yet, and have not been studied yet in ways that make it possible for even a very interested person to have ready access to it. So the historical and philological side of the discipline is important. And it's something that we need to always, even those who don't do it need to support, I think. A second approach that you'll see out there is a more history of philosophy approach, which tends to be the way in which I've approached it. And that is really a way of understanding through philosophical engagement. What that means is it's reading and thinking with these philosophers and trying to get them right in the first instance. So I would like to be able to tell you what Dharmakirti or Gangesha would say if they were here today. How would he explain his own views? And so that requires a certain kind of careful attention to literally the words on the page. And also not just to the words on the page, but to actually enter into the philosophical conversation they're having. In my view, you can't actually do good exegesis without at least pretending you're a philosopher yourself and engaging in those questions and thinking them through. It's very hard to follow these texts. People who work in this kind of historical or engaged historical way are committed to doing sort of accurate reconstructions of the arguments, where accurate is really important, and also to asking the question of were they right or wrong. The Sanskrit philosophers we read and study were not historians. They thought they were making arguments that ought to persuade everyone. And so we do them a disservice if we don't take them seriously and say, okay, they think I ought to be persuaded by this. I think they're a little crazy. Here's why. What would they say back? To respect them is not just to understand them. To respect them is to take them seriously by engaging in their ideas. And just like they ask of their peers whether they're right or wrong, we should ask whether they're right or wrong. We should say to them, hey, look, you don't know about chemistry. This is what chemistry says. And I'm sure if they were here, they would say, oh, that chemistry, that's really fascinating. How does it affect my argument? Oh, okay, I guess I have to get rid of this piece, but that doesn't affect my main point. So we have to respect them enough to take them seriously. And that's also part of the historical process, the historical way of engaging, as I understand it. There's another way that you'll see people write about Sanskrit philosophers, which is less historical and more, I'll call it a learning from approach. That is, they'll read and think with Sanskrit philosophers about, say, an issue. They'll learn from them and then write a constructive philosophical piece where they maybe mention them as friends in their journey, right? They're usually less concerned with getting them exactly right and more just sort of, here's what I've learned from my conversation with them. I think that's also important. The way in which you assess even these three ways of working with Sanskrit text, philology, history, what I'm calling learning from, is of course very different, right? A philological way of assessing the success of a project is one way. Historical accuracy is another way. Learning from is a third way. Maybe learning from would be more, it doesn't matter if they get them right. What matters is whether the idea they're developing from conversation with them is good, or the argument is good, right? Accuracy may be less important. There's another way that you often hear people talking about working with Sanskrit philosophy, which is a more fusion or cosmopolitan approach. And that's really where you think freely with a range of thinkers, all within a few pages. And I have views on how we ought to prioritize this, but you can ask me about that when we talk if you want. So just approaches, just two quick things left. The first is, where do we go from here? I think that it's important to think of philosophy in the term Indian philosophy, Sanskrit philosophy, South Asian philosophy as an academic discipline. If one of the objectives is to have this kind of material taught in contemporary Euro-American style institutions, I think it's just the most practical and intellectually responsible way forward, even as the material that one brings to the discipline, the questions, the ideas, the distinctions, is going to change the discipline itself. I think it's best to start there. The second thing is we need to focus on individual philosophers and not so-called philosophical schools. I don't think it's really helpful to talk about what Nyaya philosophers thought. There is no Nyaya school that thought anything. They're individual Nyayikas, Nyaya philosophers who thought things, and we should focus on individuals and their work. These individuals were part of text traditions, but I don't think we should focus on text traditions. We should think, let me put it this way. We should think of individuals who are part of text traditions and not text traditions as being constituted by individuals. Why? Because I think the right model should be a counterfactual approach to the history of philosophy, or a dinner party model. That is, as I said before, if this person were here, what would she want? Unfortunately, all the Sanskrit philosophers are he. What would he want to say to me? How would he try to convince me of his point of view? What would he say when he came to my epistemology class? I think to do that, we need to focus on individuals and their work. The third thing is I think we need to focus on actually arguments and not just positions. And that means philosophical engagement and not just reporting. It is important to report, it is important to get them right, but that's not enough. We need to ask if they were right or wrong. And we need to focus on the argumentative context in which they actually did their work. So the best way forward, I think, is there needs to be cooperation between people who are philologists, philosophers, and a third group who I've not mentioned much is traditionally trained scholars. Some of the greatest readers and interpreters of this work don't speak English well enough or well at all to participate in this conversation. And it's incumbent upon us to reach out to them and to learn how to engage with them. Some of these traditional scholars they're just absolutely brilliant. They know more about this material and have thought more deeply about it certainly than I ever will. And I often feel somewhat, maybe ashamed is too strong, but somewhat embarrassed when I meet such people and I think, I'm teaching this stuff. I shouldn't be teaching this. You should be teaching it. But I understand that that isn't possible for a variety of reasons. So it's historians, philologists, philosophers, and traditionally trained scholars need to work together to help further the field. What do we need to make all this happen? I think first and foremost, we need excellent philosophers who are interested in working with Sanskrit texts, even in translation. People at the more historical and philological side of things tend to be Sanskrit snobs and tend to say, well, no one can really work on this unless they've spent half their adult life, like I have, studying classical Sanskrit, right? I think that's not right. People at the philosophical end are also philosophy snobs. They think, oh, the people who are doing all the historical and philological work are just doing spade work. You know, that's really all the stuff upstream. The really interesting stuff is what we're doing. We're taking the ideas seriously. I think that's not a helpful way to talk about the distinction either. So we need excellent philosophers who are interested in working with Sanskrit texts. We need non-specialists in the field who are interested in including Sanskrit materials in their courses. So if you were to teach a course in epistemology, why not have a unit on Dignaga's epistemology? Teaching a course in aesthetics, why not have a unit on the theory of aestheticized emotions or rasa? I think we need to have historically and philologically rigorous and yet readable English translations of these texts. When you start teaching Sanskrit philosophy, you realize how we have very few good materials. And my approach is always, I want my students to read the philosophers in their own words. I don't want them to just read secondary articles about them. I want them to hear from the horse's mouth, if you will. And that requires translations. It also requires studies to help people understand the translations. We need philosophical papers in mainstream journals, and we need consumers of all this, not only in the academy, but also outside. A point to make is, why is this so hard? Why is it so difficult to do this? And I think there's a couple of reasons that are worth talking about before I get to the last point. The first is that translating is always difficult, and it's especially difficult when you're the first person translating a text from a classical language or any language into contemporary English. It's especially so when you're trying to translate technical philosophical texts, right? Technical philosophical texts are hard in English. We need English translations of those, right? Technical philosophical texts in German are really hard when they're properly translated into English. Technical Sanskrit philosophical texts are like that too. They're very hard to translate into English. That's one point. Not an interesting point, but a real point. There are two other points I think that are more interesting. And it has to do with something that it took me a while to fully appreciate. And that is, and that's just because I was and continue to be a little naive and a little bit historically insensitive. And it's that the way we read, the way we understand, our expectations of what it means to understand or argue is historically sensitive. And for those of us who've been educated in Euro-American style institutions, we share more than we realize a criterion understanding of what it means to how one writes if you're trying to get someone to understand, if you will, or how you present an argument. Now, look, we know there's variation. If you read Hume and Kant, they present arguments very differently than the way a contemporary philosopher would. And it's hard to take a Humean style argument or a Kant style argument and rephrase it as a contemporary philosopher would. That's hard. With Sanskrit philosophy, it's even harder to do that. One is because the way in which traditional Sanskrit philosophers were taught to present arguments and trained to receive arguments and interrogate them is just very different than the way we are and we have been. What that means is, if you were to take a Sanskrit philosophical text and try and outline it as it is presented, and then you were to try and represent that outline as if you were just reproducing the same argument today, it would look nothing alike. Does that make sense? You take a Sanskrit philosophical argument, you make an outline following the order of the text. Then you take that outline and you say, all right, I need to now re-outline this so I understand it. The way in which you would re-outline it would bear almost no relation to the way in which it was found in the text. That makes it hard, even when we have translate. It also makes it, because it's hard to understand, and it also makes it hard when you have a translation for someone else to understand it, right? It's not that simple. Why is that? I think we can begin to talk about this, and it's that Sanskrit philosophical texts are not presented to an abstract audience directly as a genre. That means that when we write contemporary philosophy papers, we're not writing for anyone in particular necessarily. We tend to be writing for an unknown group of people. Even if we're debating with an individual philosopher in our paper, we'll say, Professor Williamson is wrong about knowledge first for these reasons. We're expecting that our primary audience isn't Professor Williamson, it is the public out there, the philosophical public out there. So our texts are presented with a kind of abstraction. Indian philosophical texts and arguments are constructed very differently. People often use the word dialogical, but let me explain what that means. Imagine you have two excellent professional philosophers who are epistemic peers debating with each other on a stage in front of an audience. Now, how does their argument go, right? Their argument is going to be sensitive to the particular objection that their opponent raises at a particular time. That's how the debate is going to be driven, right? So you'll have an issue, maybe someone will state a position, you'll have a response, and it'll kind of go in an outlining way, right? Sometimes it may take a long digression this way. Sometimes it may stick to the point. Now, if you were to listen to that and outline the blow-by-blow nature of that debate, it would be one thing. If you were to represent that debate, say to your colleague who wasn't there, someone said, hey, what was the debate between Professor A and B about? What were their arguments? You would reconstruct it differently. So Indian philosophical texts are presented as a genre more as this kind of semi-formal debate, which means it's a challenge for us who've been trained to receive and understand arguments in one way, to actually even say sometimes what the debate's about and what the main moves are. So even excellent philosophers, it takes quite a bit of time to learn how to read these texts in their own words and hear these philosophers in their own voices, and then take a step back and say, okay, I just spent 4 hours reading this. What have I learned? What's the argument? What's the view? Why does he think that? You get the point. So that's one reason it's hard. It's hard because of the language. It's hard because we don't have the resources if you're interested. It's also hard because of the nature of the texts and debates. It's hard because the scholastic tradition, and scholastic traditions are always hard to begin to get entry in. Once you get entry into it, it's remarkable. It's like having the keys to the kingdom. All of a sudden you have this incredibly vast, shockingly rich, and I'm continually shocked at how rich it is, philosophical world, from which we surely have a lot to learn, which you realize right away, even if you don't quite know what we've learned from it. And so it's worth the effort, I guess I'm trying to say. Last topic is a question to all of you. What does South Asian philosophy, as I understand it, have to do with public philosophy as you understand it? Or what should it have to do with it? But I would end with one thought. And the thought is that maybe something that's relevant is the idea that there may be alternative possibilities in a different philosophical world, such as a Sanskrit philosophical world. Alternative possibilities in all kinds of areas, including metaphysics, epistemology, philosophy of language, etc. I thought I'd give you an example from an area I said was not represented, maybe something about ethics or social or political philosophy, to illustrate my point, because I think it'll be easier than trying to do it with some technical issue in logic or epistemology. Most South Asians of a certain age don't say thank you to their parents. I don't know if that's true for any of the South Asians in the audience here, but for me, it was true. You don't say thank you to your parents. I remember as a child, I tried to, and I got yelled at. It's not a translation question. If I'm speaking to them in Marathi, even if I could translate Sanskrit into Marathi, say, it wouldn't work. They would still get mad at me, right? Why? It's not that I don't value them or appreciate them. Why do they get mad at me if I say thank you? One way to think about it is that maybe thank you they see as transactional. You know, you say thank you, someone says you're welcome, it somehow completed some kind of a transaction. Whereas, at least in many South Asian families I know, that transactional way, maybe transactional is too negative, I don't mean it in a negative way, but that positive transactional way is just, it's viewed negatively. What happens in South Asian families? As you know, there's just never-ending patterns of obligation, responsibility, reciprocity. It never ends. You could either say it's always transactional, or as I think, it's just never transactional. And so when you say thank you, people get mad because they think they're, what, are you trying to shut the door on what you now have to do or on what your responsibility is or obligation is? Okay, who cares about this? Why is this relevant? This suggests, at least to me, that there's an alternative way of inhabiting and being in a South Asian family than there is when I'm interacting with the family of my friends. In my case, my children say thank you to me, and I find it weird, but they still do say thank you to me, and it's a perfectly fine way of interacting, but it's different than the way in which I interacted with my parents. What does this have to do with alternative possibilities? I think there are a lot more concepts like thank you than we let on. I'll admit, I think that justice may be like this. I think rights may be like this. I think state may be like this. I actually think that many of the concepts that we use to think about social and political philosophy, for example, are a little bit more like thank you than we want to imagine. And so one of the possibilities for looking at Sanskrit philosophy is to have different sets of concepts with which to think about the social and political. Some of those concepts we may want to reject because they're awful. Others might be useful to us. We might need to figure out maybe why contemporary rights talk is, or maybe it helps us understand the limitations of contemporary rights talk. Maybe it helps us understand alternative possibilities to it. Anyway, this was just suggesting that maybe one way in which my way of understanding South Asian philosophy might be relevant to how some of you understand public philosophy is by providing resources for alternative possibilities or alternative resources for what's already familiar. Anyway, that's really all I wanted to say as a way of introduction. And as I said, I really want to be useful and I don't take criticism personally. So there's really no question in my mind that's off limits. So, or criticism that's off limits. So I'll turn it over to all of you. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for that. I cannot tell you how invaluable that has been. And I have so many questions, and I'm sure everyone else does as well. And I think a way that we can do this is probably if people just want to type out their question, put that in the chat, or feel free to raise your hand or just put your name in the chat, and then I can just ask you to, oh, we already have questions. Amazing, great. Chris, we'll start with you, and then Amir will go on to you.
Hi, Chris. Thank you so much for the wonderful chat. I had a kind of a question early on, and then the lecture was so intriguing that I sort of forgot it a little bit because I was so engaged with what ended up coming up. So just please bear with me as I try to flesh it out. But it had something to do with, I guess, possibly the limitations of choosing a sort of linguistic community as the parameters for your categorization of philosophical work. Mm-hmm. And I see the appeal of that, of course, because like you mentioned, there'll be certain conventions attached to the language. And of course, it'll be certain concepts that are shared and everything will be understandable to the communities that they're talking with and speaking to. But I wonder, how could this possibly obscure the influences from traditions that, the influences from writers that weren't writing in Sanskrit that were read by these philosophers, or philosophers from different areas that began writing in Sanskrit in order to produce works. I'm also not aware with the complexities of, who was speaking Sanskrit at the time and who was writing in Sanskrit and what sort of engagement across cultures and different linguistic communities there were. So yeah, I'm just asking for a little bit more clarification and wondering what kind of dangers are there in obscuring, yeah, the underlying connections between many different languages and many different cultures if you're only choosing one language to look at in terms of what was actually written down.
So naturally, whenever you make a choice, you're making a choice, right? To group certain things together, and which means there's other things outside the group. The question is it a reasonable choice, and what's the price? So one thing about Sanskrit as a language is it was kind of the scholarly language for a really astonishing and vast area. So people belonging to very different, even cultural traditions, right? Subcultural traditions, people who spoke different mother tongues, people who belonged to different religious traditions, people who had different theological views, people who even were not part of the subcontinent in Southeast Asia, etc. Sanskrit was the language of intellectual work. I mean, a little bit like Latin. So it was already transcultural and translocal. Now, Sanskrit was an academic language in that sense. So there were large groups of people who did not know it, who did not read it, who did not produce work in it. To some extent, we don't know much about what those people thought and how they interacted with these philosophers. We don't really know that much. But yes, their voices are not part of this conversation. And it's not even clear to me how. It would be great if we could find ways of understanding how they did relate. But within these texts, there's almost no acknowledgement of those voices or any indication of how those voices would contribute or not contribute to the debate. But it's already I don't want to suggest, we shouldn't think that Sanskrit philosophy is narrow. It's astonishingly vast, but it's not infinite, right? There are plenty of people around who didn't produce work in it. So I guess I don't think it's very dangerous, as long as one is aware that Sanskrit philosophy does not mean South Asian philosophy and does not mean Indian philosophy. It just means that it means a philosophical text produced by people who worked in classical Sanskrit. It is a meaningful, individuatable intellectual tradition that, of course, touched on others as well. Did that help, or did that not answer your question?
Oh yeah, that's really cool. That's sort of what I was thinking. I was just worried, there could be like these hidden causes, so to speak, about texts or people that weren't working in Sanskrit that had influenced but weren't mentioned in these books and stuff like that. But yeah, I understand.
Yeah, look, you never want to say never. It would be, I just don't know. I can't think of many good examples of that. That's all. Given the parameters of what I said, yeah.
Do you want to go next?
Yeah, I can do. Thank you so much, Professor Patil. It was, a really brilliant talk, and especially your doxographical clarifications were very useful. I guess I just want to perhaps push you on one point that perhaps I was a bit more cautious about, which was towards the beginning, you were talking about what you said was perhaps a more conservative approach, in that you felt comfortable that Sanskrit philosophy can be engaged with through the lens of intellectual discipline of academic philosophy as it's kind of instantiated in Western departments. I mean, I think perhaps I'm a little bit more cautious about that. And maybe for one perhaps reason in particular is that philosophy in the West, in the way that it's developed, has kind of created this distinction between religion and philosophy. And I find it interesting that you mentioned, was it Shankara as a philosophical theologian? So it seems like you're working in your mind with some sort of separation between philosophy and religion. But it seems to me that that's perhaps a paradigmatically Western development, because of course the Buddhist philosophers as well would rely on textual authority to a really great degree. They would have soteriological concerns that kind of underpin their whole project. So it seems to me that perhaps that separation between philosophy and religion is one that doesn't exist in the Indian world. And there's, to my knowledge, no great Sanskrit equivalents for the words philosophy and religion. So I just wonder what you think about that as a particular way in which the Western intellectual academy might be violent to the Indian tradition.
So very good observation, very good question. I actually think it's not violent at all, because I think that the relationship between philosophy and what we're calling religion, as you look at the history of, as you look at Sanskrit writing philosophers, is not all that different than the relationship between Euro-American philosophers and their Christianity in the past. Just because Euro-American philosophers were Christian and wrote about Christianity doesn't mean that there isn't a distinction between someone who is, say, writing as a philosopher and someone who's writing as a theologian. Look, these distinctions don't matter that much to me, actually. The reason I make the distinction is that these Vedanta groups, I think of them as disciplinary orders, and I think of these philosophical traditions as knowledge systems. And so the knowledge systems did have independent histories, independent of disciplinary orders, independent of the Vedanta disciplinary orders, for a long time. And at a certain point in history, the disciplinary orders became the right institutional home for these knowledge systems to work. So you could belong to a range of different disciplinary orders, different Vedanta groups, and still be a Nyaya philosopher. So being a Nyaya philosopher for them might have been a little bit like being a chemist. You'd be a Jesuit chemist, a Hindu chemist, a Buddhist chemist, right? It was a day job. Whereas some of the knowledge systems also were independent of these disciplinary orders. Now, that's one way of, so by theology, I mean stuff that goes on in disciplinary orders. By philosophy, I meant stuff that goes on independently of them. Now you might say, look, the philosophical traditions do talk about liberation, do talk about soteriology. I don't see why soteriology has to be about religion and isn't also part of philosophy. It's about, what makes it about philosophy is not necessarily the topic, it's how that topic is pursued. So even the issue of testimony, you said Buddhist philosophers cite scripture. Just so you know, that's only to a certain point in history, after which they no longer accept testimony as a source of knowledge. So the issue is not even whether testimony, it's how you talk about testimony, whether you think testimony is a source of knowledge, how you debate about it. So I guess my view is, I don't think there's any topic that makes something a philosophical topic or a religious topic. I think it's more how you go about pursuing it that distinguishes the two. So I don't think it does any violence. I don't think it's that different, actually.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I could say more, but I guess if other people have questions, then we can move on to that.
A comment that just came up on the chat was a professor from IIT Bombay said, sometimes we do injustice to Greeks when we try to over-rationalize them. What do you think would be problematic to do with Indian philosophy? Sorry, you can maybe respond to this, but then we'll just go on to Tian's question.
Yeah, sure. It's very briefly. I think whenever we get a particular Indian philosopher wrong, we're doing injustice to them. That could be over-rationalizing, under-rationalizing, whatever. If we get them wrong, we're doing injustice to them. That's what I think.
Tian, do you want to go on and ask your question?
Oh yeah, hi Professor. Hi.
Hi, Tian.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. It was very enlightening. Sorry my camera's broken, so you won't be able to see me. Yeah, well, so my main interest is in Buddhist philosophy, and focusing on kind of the debate, the concept of debate in Sanskrit philosophy. As you know, in Tibet, there's still this very living tradition of debating using kind of Dignatak's treatises and Dharmakirti's kind of treatises as a guidebook to debate. And I was wondering if anything like that has been preserved in kind of the Indian traditions, and is it still kind of, would you consider that kind of a living tradition of philosophy in practice? And I was wondering if you could talk about maybe some sources that was preserved in the mainland India, or if there are any.
So I absolutely consider the living tradition of Tibetan Buddhist philosophy to be living, to be incredibly rich, constructive, and important. We don't have much in classical Sanskrit that gives us firsthand insight into exactly how these debates may have taken place. We don't have the same kinds of debate manuals for Buddhist, to the same extent as there is in Tibet. So the sources are pretty slim that way. You can email me and I can give you some specific ideas, but I think it's as you know, it's just totally different than what we have with the Tibetan material.
Okay,
yeah.
But how do we deal with kind of Sanskrit materials that are preserved only in Tibetan, or in other languages, right?
Yeah, so that's not a problem. It's just, those are just Tibetan translations of Sanskrit texts.
Okay.
Right? We have to just work with the Tibetan and understand it and ask questions about how it relates to the original.
Sure.
As you know, in the non-Buddhist part, in the non-Buddhist Indian philosophical world, there is a lot of systematic work on debate and rhetoric in the so-called Vada literature, and that's extensive. But that's really not the same as sort of the day-to-day nuts and bolts of how you debate somebody.
Okay.
Yeah, it's called Vada literature.
All right. Okay. Thank you. Thanks.
Great. Justin, if you want to ask your question.
Thanks so much, Parimal. That was great.
Hi,
hey, I wanted to take you up on your challenge about identifying an ethical.
Good.
Because, well, first of all, I think your comments were really insightful about that. Like, I have a friend recently who's been asking me, Justin, what do the Buddhists say about meta-ethics, and how do they come for good and evil and all
Justin,
that?
before you go on, I'll say one thing. I should have said that I didn't, that there's a lot of work in Sanskrit philosophy on meta-ethics. There's
really?
just not much, there's no work really on what you would say is other than meta-ethics in a philosophically familiar way. I'll just bracket that.
Well, then 2 questions. What do you think are the really good meta-ethical texts? And 2, where do you put Shantideva's Bodhicharyavatara?
Yep. So first, Shantideva's Bodhicharyavatara is always the text that people say as a counterexample.
Yeah.
That's the first thing. So all I would say is Shantideva's Bodhicharyavatara, when people write about it, they write about maybe 50 verses at most. The rest of it, no one seems to care about. So we're really only talking about 50 verses of it at best. The parts on anger, the parts on exchanging oneself as other. Remember, I didn't say there aren't texts that couldn't be a basis for excellent work in ethics. So obviously Sanskrit intellectuals cared about ethics and political theory. But look at how Shantideva's text is written versus the way in which every other Buddhist philosophical text is written. There are texts that are path literature that have lots of ethical insights. But the point is, it's written in a fundamentally different way. And that's the main point, that they didn't pursue ethics and thinking about politics in at all the same ways they pursued metaphysics, epistemology, etc. And so that's why I said there's really no work of philosophical ethics. There's plenty of work of ethical significance, but it's just so different. So that's the qualification of the bold claim. But I would personally say that the Bodhicharyavatara is not a work of philosophical ethics. It's a work of something else that has some ethical import in it. What was the second question, Justin? I'm sorry, I lost it.
I want to know what you thought of meta-ethics. What are good sources for
meta-ethics? So the one place you'll find meta-ethics is whenever people discuss philosophy of action. So in the Abhidharma literature, right? Chapter 4 of the Kosha and the commentaries will stuff on action. And in non-Buddhist context, it has to do with, it comes in a weird place. So it comes in the semantics of command utterances. So if I say, please shut the door, you understand something when I say, please shut the door, and you act on the basis of that in some cases. So that provides the basic resources for a theory of action. And in the context of discussing theories of action, you get some of our traditional meta-ethical topics. So that's discussed. So anything about action, Justin, is the place to look.
Anwar, if you want to ask your question.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Professor. This was really illuminating. I would love to hear more about the sort of comment that you made about modernity and the epistemic break. And I'm particularly interested in, I mean, at least from the like Islamic context, what a lot of that discussion surrounds like traditional learning, and how traditional learning was sort of totally transformed by colonialism. And so I would just love to hear more about that. And then if you can, I would really also appreciate any like introductory readings that are good and not based on the misconceptions that you identified earlier, for someone who doesn't really have very much experience with Sanskrit philosophy.
Okay. I think a really good place to start is the Peter Adamson podcast, History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps, that he did with Janardhan Ganeri. I think it's a really good place just to start and get a lay of the land. And after that, I think this is going to sound really weird. Everyone likes different kinds of things and different kinds of writing. So I really think just looking at a few introductions to Indian philosophy and seeing which one resonates with you. I would choose one that doesn't talk about the 6 systems. So even if you do, as long as you understand what you're getting and what it's not, you should be fine. But I would start with the podcast. It's a relatively simple and pleasurable way to get some background. The issue of the epistemic break, colonialism obviously transformed so much and had an impact on almost everything. But it didn't destroy everything and didn't fundamentally alter everything in such a way that what came before and what came after are disjoint. So traditional Sanskrit learning still takes place. Traditional Sanskrit scholars are still educated, and they always have been, in the sense that those traditions continue. There's no major rupture. There's no major break. There are changes, but I don't see those changes as being, I mean, not all of those changes. Some of those changes are just changes, right? Not due directly to colonialism. And some are due to colonialism. But I guess what I mean is the idea that somehow there's some kind of a gap that really needs to be bridged, and that you see that gap in the textual record is just, I just don't think it's there at all. I see no evidence for it. Did that help, or was that not on point?
No, that is helpful for the framing. And I would just love to hear a little bit more about the what the training looks like. That's probably a big question, but.
It depends. So, I mean, yeah, it's a big question, but let me just say briefly, just like for us, there are different kinds of institutions, and there are different kinds of institutions in pre-modern India, different kind of educational institutions. So Buddhist monastic educational complexes tend to be larger, right? Many people, almost like universities in a sense, whereas at least early on, the non-Buddhist Brahminical context seemed to be more smaller, maybe even much smaller than small colleges, individual teachers or small groups of teachers with a very finite number of students. Later on, as I mentioned, these disciplinary orders or these religious orders had large institutions and large monastic communities. So there were really a range of institutions and a range of sizes. And what you learned also depended on your interest and discipline, right? So you could be in the philosophy department, if you will, or you could be in the poetry department. A couple things, everybody had general education requirements, right? Basically. So everybody studied Sanskrit grammar. I'm sure everybody studied poetry and literature and some basic introductory philosophical texts, in addition to the religious texts they were working on, if they worked on them seriously. And then they specialized just like today. So I don't think it was that different in the broad outlines. We don't actually have, as far as I know, good curricular records of exactly what people studied throughout history. We just don't have those records. So it's relatively minimal. But the teaching was usually small group. People would read texts out loud and teach them line by line, in a sense.
That's helpful, thank you.
Yeah.
We have a question from Alice in the chat, and it's a long one.
Boy.
I'll read it out.
Okay.
So I'm wondering if you could relate the question so far to a reflection on the limits of our current methodological practices. Who is included and gets a say on our conceptions of methodology, and how these affect our abilities to engage with various South Asian or Sanskrit or spatiotemporally distant discourses to ours today. So what is it specifically that justifies calling one methodology philosophy versus another? Example, this has been used to exclude feminist philosophy from the discipline today, much like many global philosophies from Anglo-European departments, and can be used to exclude religious work from philosophy today. Obviously, this changes over time, so how do we moderate our own conceptions of philosophical reasoning when they are justified and when they're oppressive? How do we regulate useful distinctions that beckon engagement from rigid obfuscations that block off groups in very practical ways when they don't fit, for example, funding categories or administrative hurdles or epistemic recognition?
Okay, very good, very important set of questions. First, the question of who. My view is anyone who wants to be part of the conversation should be part of the conversation. We know that there are many barriers to people who want to be part of it, but in a way that's incumbent on, say, someone like me, who is in a place where I can make sure or do more to make sure that the range of voices about methodological questions and approaches is heard. So I would say it should be anyone who is interested. Who's responsible for making sure that happens? I would say people like me who are in institutions where I think we have that responsibility, if that was the right question. The second part about justification is tricky because, as I said, I think because it's so hard to think about that in the abstract, I prefer to think about what's on the ground. And what's on the ground are contemporary Anglo-American philosophy departments. So if the idea is, I think, say, this ought to be in philosophy, and the philosophy and professional philosophers say, no, it should not be included. So for example, many, when I was a student, people thought this way about Sanskrit philosophy. And you have a conversation. You say, oh, why? Have you read a Sanskrit philosophical book? Say no. Oh, well, could we talk about one and you can tell me if you think it's philosophy? Okay. I mean, this sounds like a way of capitulating to the existing power structures and existing picture, right? But one way of changing the community, if you want to be a part of that community, you have to enter into it, right? And so this was at least one way of entering into it. This is a conservative approach. There's other equally viable approaches. So for example, there's some topics in philosophy that were just never given a chance, and not for good philosophical reasons, but for really bad reasons, which we all know. And in that case, I think it's important to make noise, right? Say, look, this ought to be included. Here's why. You have a responsibility to tell me why it's not included. Why does it not count? It looks to me like it's just the kind of work you're doing, but on a different topic. Why is this topic not appropriate for that kind of inquiry? Or why is this mode of writing not part of philosophy? I think that this is itself a philosophical question and ought to be had as a philosophical conversation. So I guess when I say there's nothing that really justifies it. It's really better thought of as having a philosophical conversation about that very question. I think that's what I think is the way to go about it. And then the issue of regulation, look, I wish I had an answer to this. We could solve so many problems. I really don't know. The only thing I know to do is to talk to people and to be open to their point of view and have a serious, if not heated, conversation with them about things that matter to me. That's how I found was the most effective way to bring about change. I know it's not the only way. And I know and I know in some cases it doesn't work and we have to do something different than the noise approach. I don't know, Alice, if that spoke to what you were asking me about.
It does. Could I ask a quick follow-up?
Yeah.
This is then asking about a specific. So for example, in your response to Justin, you said that you don't think the BCA is like a philosophical text, although it might be a philosophical interest, if I'm paraphrasing you correctly, for ethics. And
Yeah.
I would wonder, like, specifically, why, for example.
So let's I mean, the Bodhicharyavatara you might want to argue is a philosophical text. I don't have much at stake in that. The issue is really this, right? Is the Matrix a work of philosophy or not? Is The Simpsons a work of philosophy or not? Is Shakespeare a work of philosophy or not? The issue is less whether it is a work of philosophy to me. That's not that interesting a question, as the question of whether one can do interesting philosophical work with it. And if one can, then one should see it. And then it seems to me it ought to be in a philosophy department. So the Bodhicharyavatara, the reason that's worth pointing is because I think there is a deep point that whenever we ask the question of are there works of philosophical ethics, this is the only one people point to. At best, it's the exception that proves the rule. And the rule is should not be something that is a source of embarrassment. It should be a source of real interest. Wow, these people could have done ethics and political theory in exactly the same way they did aesthetics, metaphysics, etc. And boy, would we be happy because we would get it. But they didn't do that. Uh-oh, why didn't they do it? It's not because they didn't care about ethics and political theory. Maybe they knew something about the nature of ethical inquiry, or the goals of ethical inquiry, or the goals of political inquiry that we ought to take seriously. What is the alternative possibility for how the subfield of ethics or political theory ought to be conceived? That's how I see it.
Thank you.
Sure. Just so you know, no one agrees with me about this, so you should feel free to keep arguing.
I know if it's time, I'd be curious to hear more about that, but I'll let other people ask questions.
I mean, I can stay on.
I realized that we might run a little bit over.
That's okay.
But we've got two questions in the chat. I might just read them out one after another, and then maybe.
Okay.
Okay. So the first question is, you say South Asian philosophy is not Sanskrit philosophy, but from your introduction, it appears there is at least Sanskritized. We know how the Sanskrit language and its intellectual traditions were kept enclosed from most of the inhabitants of the region, especially from those considered lower in the social system. What are your thoughts on Sanskrit philosophy being dominant in South Asian philosophy and your introduction? And then the next question is, you've hinted a couple times at the possibility of the introduction of Sanskrit philosophy changing academic philosophy from the inside, so to speak. Can you perhaps talk a bit more about what those changes might look like?
Okay. So the first question. So I think of Sanskrit philosophy as a subfield. If we're going to use South Asian philosophy as a label for a field, then Sanskrit philosophy would be a subfield of it. There would be plenty of South Asian philosophy that is not Sanskritized at all, and that would not be Sanskritized. So the reason I use South Asian philosophy, the reason I use Sanskrit philosophy or think of Indian philosophy that way is just because of the amount of text, the volume of material, how central that was to this scholastic culture. That's all. There's plenty of other stuff that's going on, that most of which we don't have records for, that's also worthy of study. So it's not to simply say that only Sanskrit philosophy is worthy of study. It's just trying to carve out what I'm focusing on and why it doesn't exhaust everything that's South Asian philosophy, even if it may be we have more material in that area than any other. The second part of it is, well, the issue of it being dominant. So I think it makes sense for it to be dominant, given how I understand what philosophy is. Most of the material that we would identify as philosophical or as the kinds of things that philosophers would be interested in engaging with would be in classical Sanskrit, at least for a certain period of history. So I guess I'm not trying to exclude anything or deny anything. It's just simply trying to carve out within this vast time period and vast areas that are ever shifting, that there is something meaningful called Sanskrit philosophy, and it's worth thinking about it that way, while at the same time recognizing that Sanskrit philosophy is not Indian philosophy in that sense, and it's also not South Asian philosophy. I don't know if that helped. The second question about, okay, if it can change academic philosophy from the inside, what might those changes be? We talked a little bit about maybe helping us reimagine what the purpose of ethics and political theory is. Another possibility is imagine doing political theory without the notion of state or rights or justice. What alternatives would there be? Also something very different to imagine. In some of the more technical areas, imagine doing philosophy of language without propositions. What would that look like? What if you started with defeasible theories of knowledge and built your epistemology that way? What if you built philosophy of language not only without propositions, but suppose you started not with assertions, but you started with commands at the foundation? The point is that although Sanskrit philosophers had very familiar and shared concerns with philosophers of today, they had some that were exactly the same and some that were very different, but they shared concerns. The way they pursued those issues and questions were often with very different distinctions and at very fundamental levels. And so trying to think about those problems in the ways in which Sanskrit philosophers did is philosophically productive. Remember, the question of why, this was phrased very nicely, but one way of asking the question is, look, where's the payoff? And that's a little bit of an unfair question, because we can ask the same question, exactly where's the payoff of studying Kant or Hume? Exactly. It gets tough, right? We can say Kant was valuable, we can begin to go into details about it. So I think that studying Sanskrit philosophy is as valuable, if your touchstone is contemporary philosophy, is potentially as valuable as studying any other smart person, right? Look, the smartest people in the history of our world didn't just write in Greek and Latin, French, German, and English. They wrote in a whole range of languages. And they wrote about topics that philosophers care about in a whole range of languages. If we're really interested, it seems to me we ought to try learning from them. You may decide that with some of them, there's nothing to learn, fine. We haven't done that yet. And my view is that if we do that seriously with Sanskrit philosophy, we'll figure out that we can learn a lot. The work that's been done so far already suggests that. And I've just tried to gesture to some of those by this last 30 seconds or so.
Parimal, thank you so much for your answers. This has been really, really great, and I feel like all of us have learned a lot. I might just end this discussion group with maybe something a bit self-indulgent, but as a history student, I get very frustrated because often there seems to be a very disciplinary dismissal in history for philosophy, but like mostly theory. And I think that the way you talk about it, but I guess also talk about academic collaboration in order to find more holistic ways of approaching, these philosophies and sort of expanding our knowledge on these, fields of study. It's just really interesting. And I mean, if you could just talk very briefly on the sort of sources that you use and how, that's just a very big conversation, because there's things to be said in terms of language. There's things to be said about, like you said, editing the material, translating the material, but then even like something as basic as access to those materials, like in terms of where are they, they're not a lot of them might not be well archived. A lot of them we might not have direct access to. Yeah.
Thank you. So just in terms of resources, the actual physical manuscripts are sometimes very hard to get. So that kind of archival material is difficult to access. The editions of Sanskrit texts are very easy to access. Most of them are found online in PDF form now. So you can pretty much find everything somewhere, either in archive.org or Digital Library of India, or some of the less upstanding sites that some of you may know of, right? So I think access to materials is both primary and secondary is actually pretty good now. By primary, I mean editions of text, and secondary literature on it. The stuff in manuscript archives is tougher. But I don't think that's all you meant. You meant something else. And I wish you could just say that again.
Well, I mean, I guess I'm wondering about, the sort of, we understand like, how rich this culture is, but we also understand how old these traditions are. And I guess I'm wondering that there must be sort of gaps in the primary sources, just in terms of things that have been lost, and like silences in archives. And just, I mean, I guess I'm wondering, like, do we even, like, do we have a, like, could you make a sort of statement about, actually, yeah, there are, like, there are gaps, and there are certain things that we'll never have access to, but, we have the majority, you can say, or like, would you say that we have a minority of the literature, and really the majority is just gone?
Look, we only have stuff, as you know, the climate in South Asia is not hospitable to preserving things for very long. We tend to only have stuff that was copied, other than inscriptions and things. So we have a lot of stuff. And we know from reading it and internal references to other texts that we're also missing a lot of stuff. What's interesting is what we don't have personal diaries of people wrote them. We don't have grocery lists or laundry stuff. We don't have lots of curriculum. So there's certain kinds of documents we don't have. So reconstructing social cultural history is really hard. It's much harder than what I do, which is reading a philosophical text and trying to make sense of it, because at least the book is there. I have the words on the page are there. I have some of the surrounding texts, sometimes commentaries. So we know there's a lot we don't have, but for this kind of scholastic material, we have an astonishing amount, most of which has never been read or studied. So there are huge gaps, huge gaps. That's why I think trying to write systematic histories is very hard. For even any of these traditions, we don't even understand one text well, let alone how that text connects to others, let alone the social political world in which that text may have been produced and consumed. When we get to the social political cultural world in which these texts were produced and consumed, and how the outsides of texts, if you will, affected the insides of texts, we don't have nearly as much information as our colleagues who work in Europe, or certainly our colleagues who work in East Asian philosophy or East Asian intellectual history. It's really tough. And I think what that means is we have to face the facts that sometimes the best argument you can make about certain things isn't worth making because it's so underdetermined by what evidence we have. So sometimes the questions we ask that are of a historical nature, at least with this kind of intellectual history, in some sense need to be guided by the materials we have available to us. This is true for the history of philosophy in India too. We don't know a lot yet.
Yeah, I guess that brings us to your question about South Asian philosophy and public philosophy, and maybe what they might have to, in dialogue with one another. Yeah, but I mean, we could go on for ages, but I know you've got a busy day, so I'll just end the recording here.
And just